Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome again to our weekly drop-in session. So this morning's session is on a topic topic of UPN, or rather Universal Process Notation. Let me share my screen and talk a little bit more about what that is. So I think there may be some of you on the call who are already familiar with UPN, with Universal Process Notation, or know a little bit about it and the history. And I'm guessing that there's probably some that have perhaps never heard of it before. So in this session, it's a chance to introduce what it is, how we use it as Skore, where it came from. And one of the reasons that we chose this topic now specifically is that actually over the past 12 months, we've seen an increasing number of inbound inquiries from businesses looking to implement UPN, or Universal Process Notation, into their businesses, and have recognized or identified Skore as a platform that supports it. We also see on our website the traffic. We've seen an increasing amount of traffic on our website to articles that we've published about this topic as well. So clearly there's a growing interest in this area, so hence why we're now talking about UPN. So first of all, what is UPN? Let me go into the map and have a look. So in very simple terms, UPN is a very simple process notation that's easy to use and easy to follow for the widest possible audience within any given organization. And so again, you'll all be familiar with the building blocks, but we'll just talk about them because we have to some extent simplified it further in Skore. So you might not be always familiar with all of the different aspects of it. But essentially, we always look at a process is made up of this core building block, which is an activity, i.e. the what that happens. Every activity should at least have one who, but also every activity should have an input, which we often refer to as the when. So the input is the trigger for the activity to happen. So it's when is this going to happen? It happens when this trigger is present. And then the output, which we often talk about as being the why. Why do I do this activity to get this output? Now, what also makes up UPN is this ability to take an activity in a process and drill down into the detail to decompose it into more detail. And that often gets called the how. So this is the activity, what we're going to do. And if I want to know how to do it, I drill down into more detail to explain that. And then the attachments will often, and you'll sometimes see this written as with or with what, or with which. With what I think is probably better. And so the attachments are often used to provide additional information that helps somebody who is doing this process, or provides access to the tools that they might need to do that process. So again, that could be linked off to policy documents. It could be linked to systems that you actually need to perform the activity. So UPN is very much looking at processes from the perspective of somebody who has to follow the process. And so all the information is presented very much in that way. And again, you'll probably recognize that the way Skore gets used, often initially, it's used in that discovery and analysis phase of a project. And only later on do you then start to rethink or reimagine your processes in terms of somebody using it as a user manual for the business, for example. But certainly UPN was all about how do you present processes to people that need to follow them in order to do work within the business. And so some of the sort of simple things around it's very much aimed at a human audience and a very wide audience, right? It's not specifically for a technical audience. It has a very limited palette of shapes, and it doesn't enforce any sort of color schemes or anything like that. Obviously, when you're using Skore to define processes, you can add things like icons and colors if you want to, but that's not a core part of UPN. Processes are very much described using human language. So again, if you think about who that audience is, or the intended audience is for UPN, It's about describing processes in a very human way. And the last one on here, which I think is quite important, is that the processes should be, when they're presented in that way, they should be easily readable to that audience. And by that I mean, ideally you want to try and make it fit on the screen. The thinking behind UPN was very much around delivering processes through through a digital medium, i.e. through screen on a laptop or a computer. And therefore, it's much easier if you can see all of it in one go on the screen rather than having to scroll around left to right or up and down. And so some of you if you've been through our training, you may have heard of us often talking about the recommended number of boxes on the screen at one time, for example, or on a diagram is 10 to 12. But really it's about, does it fit neatly onto the average size screen that people will be looking at it? So that's a little bit basics about what UPN actually is. I want to talk a little bit about the history of UPN. Where did it come from? Because it has quite a long history, especially when compared with some of the other notations that you might be familiar with, which I'll talk about in a second. But it actually was, so it was originally developed by an organization whose name has now escaped me. But they started looking at it in the US in the late 1960s. And it was originally called the Structured Analysis and Design Technique. And it was adopted by the US Air Force in 1973. And the reason that they adopted this approach and rebranded it, or their version of it, they called IDEF 0, IDEF standing for ICAM Definition for Functional Modeling. It's a mouthful. And you can see an example of an IDEF diagram there on the page. And one of the reasons that the US Air Force adopted this is, if you think at that time, they were developing jet fighter aircraft, and which were starting to become more sophisticated in terms of the control systems. So they were starting to experiment with computer aided control systems within those aircraft. So the machinery and the whole package that they were starting to build and deliver was becoming a lot more complex than it had been in previous iterations. And so they really wanted to, or really needed, a way to understand at quite a simple level the interactions between these different complex systems. So you've got the mechanical machinery of the jet aircraft, you've got the humans sitting in it controlling it, and then you've got the new computer systems that were coming in to aid with the control of that aircraft. And so you can see it has quite a long history and a good pedigree, and it's a systems modeling approach. So it's designed to recognize the complexity often inherent within human-based organizations. And just as an example of that systems modeling, where it's quite interesting, is it allows you to actually look at a process, for example, from a very high level and recognize or understand that some parts of that process can be easily deconstructed into detail and understood, and others can't, but they're actually too nebulous and flexible that we can't always drill down into the details, but it still allows you to place that structure around it. Now, while that's quite powerful, it was still quite technical, so it's a lot easier than perhaps some other techniques, but still required a good deal of expertise to use. And so emerging in the 1990s, we started to see various vendors actually take IDEF 0 and start to simplify it in certain ways to make it a bit easier and more appealable to, and more applicable in a more general use. So one of those companies was Nimbus, a company called Nimbus Partners, through their Nimbus Control business process management platform. And so for some of you on the call will know us as founders of the business, that's one of the places that we worked and first came across this technique. And what started to happen during the early 2000s is we started to see the emergence of other notations for modeling processes. And so often in conversations with businesses, it was around, okay, how does this compare with different types of notation? Why should we use this one versus another one? And by this point, this as an approach was being adopted by some of the largest organizations in the world. By the late 2000s, I mean, organizations like HSBC, Barclays, AstraZeneca, Novartis, Chevron, Shell, BP, among many other companies were using this to some extent within their organizations. And so, as I say, in the late 2000s, we first then started to look at, okay, how do we more formalize this approach? So we've taken idea zero and we've simplified it, but how do we sort of really make that stand out? And so I'm going to put my hand up, and I actually sat down one day and said, we need some sort of specification. So I drafted the original specification for UPN. It then went through many iterations, and we worked with various teams and organizations to really clarify what that was. But it was all about simplifying it down, right down to those basic building blocks that I showed in the first screen, which was all about what is this for? It's about communicating how things work in an organization to that widest possible audience. And you'll see the note that I put on the screen there that in recent years, Salesforce.com, so originally the CRM, but now sort of growing out to the cloud-based ERP type platform, now recommend this through their Trailhead training platform as the recommended way to go and document processes within an organization. And with a weight like that behind it, that's obviously one of the things that's really driving the interest in UPN, and why we're certainly seeing a lot more interest and traffic from that recently. So quickly, just want to, again, I've mentioned this a few times already, but just sort of compare a very quick comparison of UPN to other notations within the common notations. Probably the most common notation we hear now is BPMN, so it's a business process modeling notation, and less common now, but certainly 15 years ago was probably much bigger than BPMN at the time, was EPC, which stands for Event Driven Process Chain. Try and get around some of these phrases. So one of the things that you'll notice about both of those examples that I put up here, and I realize that the one's quite simple, one's very simple, and the other one's really just the palette, but they are very rich visual semantic languages. And what that means is that they have taken the visual nature and really sort of gone with the visual nature of describing lots and lots of different types of events, activities, and interactions that take place within any given process. So while it's very rich in a visual sense, it then becomes like learning another language for people that use it, because there's lots and lots of different aspects to it that need to be remembered. And it's the same for both of those notations, that there's lots of different shapes and colors that mean different things. And so as an audience, they're very much targeted at that more expert type community rather than the general or wider business community that UPN has been targeted at. The other aspect to them is that they don't as easily accommodate the functional decomposition, so that ability to break down the process. Now they do, and most vendors will support that. Vendors that support BPMN, for example, will support some sort of sub-process decomposition, but it's approached from a very different angle. And that is, if you go back to what I was saying about UPN being based on a systems-based modeling approach, what's really important in a systems-based approach is that recognition of complexity that can't always be controlled. And therefore we start to treat systems, if you like, as a black box, and we may be able to understand it or we may not. Until we go and investigate, we don't know. But if we treat it like a black box, what's more important for us to understand is what are the inputs and outputs of that box, because with any given system you can start to understand and predict, if I put this input, what is the output that comes out? And that's one of the things that makes it a system. Now, it mightn't be that we can't understand how that does it inside, but that's what's important. And you'll remember from the UPN is this real focus on defining both inputs and outputs for activities. It helps us to do that. These other approaches don't tend to put so much of an emphasis on that. And therefore, it's very much about the specific activities that happen. So it's very difficult to then model something out that is perhaps nebulous, as I mentioned before. Okay, and then I'm going to move on slightly to then how UPN has been adopted and developed in Skore. So one of the things that we really wanted to do, while we found UPN an incredibly powerful approach to mapping processes, we still felt that it could be simplified to some extent to make it even easier for people to pick up and adopt and use within organizations. So not just as that sort of building a documentation that you push out to people within the business, but also starting to get more people within the business involved in the creation and modeling of processes using the technique. We were probably the first, certainly we were the first a vendor to actually adopt putting the questions directly into the boxes. So when you drop the boxes onto the canvas, it said straight away what, who, and why. It was the original version of how we did it in Skore. We then went out and tested that with various teams, and again with that view to empowering more people to be able to pick this up, learn it quickly, and model with the processes. And one of the things that we started to find is that people got a bit stuck sometimes in what did what actually mean, or the who, or the why. And actually the why tended to be the most complicated. So we experimented with various different ways of presenting the questions, and that's how we came up with what happens, who does it. But we were also talking to and working with a lot of teams who were adopting agile methodologies. And again, if you're not familiar with it, there's an approach to gathering requirements, which they call the user story. And the user story is all about understanding a requirement, but knowing who, but providing context. So not just saying, I want a button in this system that opens a report, for example. It's about saying, who wants the button, what's the button going to do, and what is the outcome that user actually wants from putting that button in. And the way they structure a user story was, as a person or role, I do this thing so that I get this output. And that's where we came to the sort of so that output. And that's certainly again, while not perfect, it really made it easier and opened up for a lot more people to be able to pick up that approach and to be able to use that and adopt it. We also wanted to really focus on the value of that output, or the importance of that output, because using some of the other tools and techniques, and I mentioned this with the BPMN and EPC just in the previous slide, is that there's no sort of enforcement for people to put an output for a given activity, and yet in UPN this is one of the most valuable tools, because from a discovery and analysis perspective, what it helps you to do is challenge people doing the process to really think much more deeply about what they're doing. It's to get them to really think about, okay, I do this piece of activity so I get an output or value. I'm delivering some sort of value to the business or to my end customer. You think about lean principles and about how everything we do should be value-adding work. We should be adding value, i.e. to the customer or to the business itself. So it really gets people into that mindset, thinking about every single activity along the way of putting that value in. So we really wanted to emphasize that. And the final thing we wanted to do around using UPN or adopting it in Skore was, again, calling out that output and activity and the who as really clearly different objects within the data, if you like. Because what that does, one thing it does is it really helps with the analysis. We go right back to the beginning of the history, and this was all about a technique for performing structured analysis and design. And what we're doing by building a tool that supports this modeling is making that analysis much quicker and easier. And then finally, the other thing is it just made it much easier to build things like the shortcuts into the tool, so we could do the sort of mapping at the speed of conversation. So I realize I've been talking quite a lot there. So essentially, just in summary, UPN is all about making processes as easy as possible for the widest possible audience to be able to follow and understand. And the way we've taken UPN and used it within Skore is all about simplifying it further, making it even easier, and opening it up for a wider audience to be able to get involved in mapping and analysing and improving processes. So on that note, I will stop there and see if there are any questions or thoughts from the group.